You probably know this guy for this thing, but from 2002 to 2005, he was primarily known for this thing. This is the Zaregoto series, or rather, its first volume, initially released on February 5th, 2002, though the art on this cover is from the Bunkoban re-release in 2008, and this specific English translation from Vertical came out in 2017. This first volume of Zaregoto is NisiOisiN's debut novel. As of writing this, there are 10 others in the mainline series, not to mention that it has 2 separate spin-off series. I would consider NisiOisiN to be my favorite writer of all time, and probably also my favorite artist, period. But given that, I've consumed depressingly little of his work. I've read Bake and Kizu, half of Nisei Volume 1, most of the first sekai novel, and I'm proud to say I'm a novel only on Katanagatari. I'm so pretentious that I refuse to watch the anime solely on the basis that I never want to give up that title. I own the first 2 Bishonen Tentaiden novels, but haven't read them yet, and aside from that, I've also watched every entry in the Monogatari TV series except for Zoku Owari. Oh, and I also read the first chapter of Cypher Academy on a whim, and have watched 2 episodes of the Zaregoto anime. But yeah, that is a mere fraction of a catalog spanning over 20 years. In addition to that, I like light novels, at least the ones that I've read so far. But on YouTube, the medium has far less content made about it than anime, not only because it's less popular in general, but also because it's more difficult to make visuals for written content, especially if you don't use a face cam, such as I. As an aspiring novelist myself, this gives me clinical depression. However, visuals are a non-issue for someone built different such as I. So I said, screw it. I'm gonna be the change I want to see in the world and read more NisiOisiN while I'm at it. Welcome to the first video in what is hopefully an extensive series talking about each volume of Zaregoto in turn as I read them. I'm gonna document my thoughts, you're gonna listen to them, and you're gonna like it. And if you do end up liking this video, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. And with that out of the way,
it was a Friday, I saw a movie but it wasn't very long, so I snuck into another one. Employees caught me, they threw me out into the mall. All in all it was pretty fun, but then it happened. I bumped into a random guy, he said excuse me and he tried to walk away, but I just had a psychic vision. I said sir I don't know why, but I know your name. I said I know your name. I know your name. I know your name. I know your name is your name.
you get it? You get the joke? It's 'cause Ichan doesn't have a name!
'Cause if the world was ending, I would go to Mars. Hop in a rocket, fly into the stars.
This video will be free of major spoilers, until I say so. Ichan is one of the most bland, boring, humorless, inhuman lead characters I have ever seen. Is what I would say if I were a complete loser, though that's roughly how Ichan views himself. Ichan is not his real name. His real name is never revealed. On the characters page at the beginning of the novel, he refers to himself as me, and in the Japanese version, boku, which means, I'm not translating that for you. If you don't know what boku means, why are you even watching an anime YouTuber? Ichan, then, is the nickname Tomo Kunagisa calls him by, and how I'll be referring to him for the remainder of this video. Ichan is apathetic and pessimistic. He rarely feels emotion, and even more rarely displays it. Because of this, much of the time, Ichan almost feels like a distant observer to the story, despite being an active protagonist. He's analyzing everything and making progress, but for the most part, he never gets emotionally invested. Most of his dialogue is uttered with the same straight, dry tone, and he rarely cracks jokes or attempts to lighten the mood. In a lesser story, Ichan might have truly been the sort of protagonist I described at the beginning of this section. After all, it can be difficult to relate to or connect with a character who so scarcely emotes. I've written a similar character to Ichan before named Rocco Fei, and to this day, there's a part of me that feels like he paled in comparison to the more energetic and bubbly Lou Clement. But fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, NisiOisiN is a better writer than I, and I can say with confidence that Ichan is one of the most fascinating protagonists I've had the pleasure of reading about in recent memory. One of the story's main themes is that of genius. What defines a genius? How do geniuses see the world? Those sorts of questions lie at the heart of this story. After all, the novel takes place on an island in a mansion where said mansion's owner, Iria, invites geniuses the world over to live with her for however long they wish. Iria sees geniuses as so valuable that she's willing to pay for all their living expenses and occasionally even pay them out of pocket just to live with her for a couple weeks. And in an island full of geniuses, Ichan sees himself as an ordinary Joe. Ichan is not on this island because he is a genius. He is on this island because he is the attendant of a genius, Tomo Kunagisa. Ichan, then, has something of an inferiority complex due to him not being a genius. But even beyond just the topic of genius, Ichan doesn't think very highly of himself. He's highly self-aware and indeed quite aware of his flaws. A decent portion of his monologue throughout the novel is him ruminating about his shortcomings. He knows he's too apathetic. He knows he's jealous of Tomo's ability to express herself so freely, and he knows he's secretly relieved that despite that, Tomo seems unhappy. He knows he tends to go with the flow to an unhealthy extent. He knows he changes his opinions depending on who he's talking to, and that if society deems an opinion incorrect, he will never speak that opinion, even if he believes it to be true. He knows he doesn't care to find the truth, and he knows that he wants to continue going with the flow without having to think too hard. He knows he lacks direction and ambition in life, and he knows his memory is far worse than average, which I know isn't that meaningful of a character flaw, but, sorry, I forgot where I was going with this. And yet, beyond being self-aware, there are times when Ichan comes off as overly self-conscious. Part of the reason why he doesn't pursue the truth is that he doesn't have faith in his ability to find the truth. He perceives the world as being too complicated for someone like him to ever understand, and because of that, he doesn't even try to understand it in the first place. Ichan will often punctuate his mental tangents with his catchphrase, "It's all just nonsense." It's like he tries to catch himself and stop his train of thought because he refuses to put stock in said train of thought. And yet, despite how he thinks about himself, Ichan isn't stupid. He and Kunagisa come to the same conclusion about the murder mystery the novel is centered around, and he's actually fairly deft at critical thinking, even though he opts to call a lot of it nonsense. Is Ichan a genius? Maybe so, maybe not. It depends on your definition of genius, but he's probably a smarter guy than I am. Another fascinating part of Ichan's character that remains mostly unexplored in this first novel, but that I assume will be more relevant later on, is that Ichan has a traumatic past. One of the most pog-worthy lines in the entire novel is a piece of monologue Ichan has when he picks up the decapitated corpse. "It had been quite a while since I'd last seen a headless body up close." The line comes completely out of left field, and is so startling that I legit stared at this sentence for like a minute straight, just mentally dealing with the ramifications of this line. Sorry for ruining the moment for you. There are other indicators of trauma in his past, as well as in Kunagisa's, but they're mostly passing and not really explored. It's an open mystery as to what exactly happens to each of them, but I cannot wait to find out the answer. This is all fascinating, but what's even more fascinating is... Several years back, when the Japanese network was still underdeveloped, that group appeared. Or, no, appeared isn't the correct expression. They never let a whiff of their identities grace the public eye. They never announced their name. How many people were there and just what kinds of people comprised this team? That was a mystery. They wreaked havoc, and more havoc. Beginning with pure hacking and cracking, they also had their hand in corporate advising and fixer fraud. It's also quietly speculated that back then they controlled a number of large corporations. The team was always despised and pursued, but it was never caught, and without ever revealing exactly what it wanted, sometime last year, suddenly, and without anything in particular having happened, it was never heard from again. Who would believe that the leader of that team? Tomo Kunagisa is I-chan's foil. She's energetic, easygoing, and able to freely express her opinions and personality. She also has a bit of a feisty side, at least toward I-chan at certain times, where she's incredibly forward in the way she speaks to him, rather jokey and flirtatious. But most importantly, she is what I-chan and Iria would consider to be a genius. She's a techie who uses 2 PCs and a workstation simultaneously without a mouse, and probably has like a gazillion tabs open at any given moment. Not to mention that her typing speed almost certainly surpasses even that of Nisio living word processor isin. The software and hardware she uses is homebrew, and far surpasses that of what is normal for the time period it takes place in. And of course, she was basically the leader of Anonymous back in the day, which gives her expertise in computers some serious credentials. Her past as one of the most elite hackers in the world, and her basically being efficiency personified whenever she's in a mile-long radius of a computer, instantly made me intrigued by her. Because, you know, that's cool as hell. Plus, I want to be able to use 3 computers at once like that. Sure, there's the cynical part of my brain that thinks the story's portrayal of computer-centric genius is a bit hackneyed and goofy, but the part of my brain that thinks she's super-de-duper cool, super-de-duper murdered the part of my brain that was ever skeptical for even a picosecond. Where were we again? Oh right. I'm the type of human garbage that buys into her character even more because I want to live in the reality where the leader of Anonymous is a cute, petite, bubbly girl. But while Tomo is a fun character in general, she gets outright fascinating when you consider her dynamic with I-chan. Her and I-chan are something of a codependent pair. Tomo is the type of girl who just does not function in everyday society. She can't handle vertical locomotion without someone there to accompany her due to some oddly specific mental disorder that's apparently bad enough that she has a legitimate diagnosis for it. But even putting that aside, Tomo is the type who doesn't care for herself in the slightest. I-chan cooks for her when he visits her house, he does her hair every morning, and she refuses to bathe herself unless I-chan is there to literally tie her up and throw her in the bathtub. On top of that, Tomo seems to rely on I-chan's presence for mental support. Like I said earlier, her past is implied to be just as traumatic as I-chan's, and so it's no surprise why she would seek to rely on someone as an emotional crutch. The two seemingly spend almost all their time together, with Tomo relying on I-chan's omnipresence in her life, and during their first on-page interaction, she literally drapes herself on top of him and says, "I'm not voicing that," as if that physical contact was what she needed to feel energized. And of course, she's in love with him. I-chan, on the other hand, pushes away all of Tomo's romantic and sexual advances, and claims to not even like Tomo all that much. He is, after all, apathetic, untethered, and uninvested in the world. And yet despite that, he has legitimate fun being at Tomo's side, and gets jealous when he hears about Tomo's male hacker friend, Ah-chan, who she's still close with. He wants to be Tomo's one and only, yet at the same time seemingly doesn't want to be her lover. So why doesn't he bang Tomo? Akane Sonoyama has the same question, my friend, but I-chan answers it as such in monologue. "I had already tried to get with Tomo before. It hadn't been out of love, but out of a desire for destruction. It didn't accomplish a thing." Although we never get explicit confirmation of what I-chan meant by a desire for destruction, reading between the lines, this takes us to my next point about Tomo and I-chan's relationship. I-chan is jealous of Tomo. Tomo, in being a foil, has everything I-chan could ever want. The ability to express herself freely, genius, emotions. It's hard not to feel jealous next to someone like that. and I imagine I-chan at some point in the past, despite his genuine affection for her, toyed with her emotions out of that jealousy. Although once again, this is speculation, and I'm sure it'll be confirmed or denied in one of the coming volumes. Don't tell me if I'm right on this or not. If you spoil me on this, my next Twitter thread on Onimai will be 60 tweets long! And yet despite that jealousy, Tomo is something of an oasis in I-chan's life. All in all, I-chan and Tomo's dynamic is as multifaceted as it is fascinating. Not to mention that she's just a bunch of fun. But although I-chan and Tomo are the most interesting characters in the story, and certainly provide a lot of evidence to show just how great of a writer NisiOisiN is, it could be argued that his more impressive feat in this story is... When I started reading Zaregoto, it'd been a few months since I'd consumed anything written by NisiOisiN. So reading about I-chan and Akane eating breakfast together while casually discussing the different roles men and women take in society, and the nature of those roles, felt like finally coming home after a long vacation to New Mexico or something. Not that I would now. Originally, I was gonna talk about each and every side character individually in this section, but then I remembered what not being an idiot is like and realized how long that'd take. So instead, I'm gonna generalize a wee bit and just go over the most interesting ways in which Nisio adds intrigue to the side characters. Because of Nisio's many strengths as a writer, I think what is perhaps his most impressive is his ability to make the audience immediately interested in a character. Decapitation is a locked room murder mystery with a lengthy list of suspects and potential victims. The book has 12 different characters that are at the very least important enough to be suspects, plus everyone's favorite rage girl. It takes some serious talent to make all of those characters interesting, and honestly, yeah, he doesn't quite accomplish that here. Rei and Akari are just kinda there. Rei gets a decent twist, I guess, but that's like at the very end of the story. Neither of these two did the murder. I don't even consider that a spoiler because, frankly, if you read this book without at least eventually realizing that they didn't do it based solely on the fact that they barely have any speaking lines and are not interesting characters in the slightest, you read the book on autopilot. Okay, so the book has 11 characters that are at least kinda cool. And yeah, I'd still say Teruko is a dubious addition to that list, but I do have something to say about her, so for the video's purposes, I'm leaving her on. Because many of the characters in the book are considered geniuses, and are explicitly brought onto the island because of that label, a lot of the cast has an extra dimension to their characterization in the form of why they are considered geniuses. They have interesting backstories and/or special abilities that explain why they're on the island. Take, for example, Yayoi Sashirono, a genius chef. She's considered a genius because of her cooking abilities, but the reason why she honed her cooking abilities in the first place is because she has better than average taste and smell. This is shown to us in a scene where Yayoi licks I-chan's hand and is able to deduce his blood type by tasting his sweat. May I remind you that NisiOisiN is world-renowned for his down-to-earth and logical representation of reality, but this ability of hers immediately sets her apart from, well, any other character I can think of, because it's an interesting and unique reason for becoming a genius chef. As I-chan remarks, she's gifted. That doesn't discount her cooking skills, but it does add an extra layer to them. Kanami Ibuki is a genius painter, and in being a genius, she prides herself on being a painter without a style. She does not specialize, but rather is an intentional generalist. Her genius then comes from being a master of every art style. And then there's the point of backstories. This aspect of characterization isn't limited to just the geniuses, although the characters being geniuses lends to them having interesting backgrounds and histories. We've already heard quite a bit about I-chan and Tomo's history, but as another example, Akane Sonoyama is one of the 7 fools of the ER3 system, a research facility where great minds gather from around the world to dedicate themselves to accumulating as much knowledge as possible. The 7 fools then are are the 7 people in the ER3 system who are deemed closest to the world's answers, which means that Akane is a genius among geniuses, a truly intelligent woman. That's why she's on the island. I feel like when a lot of writers try to distinguish many characters in a group, the first thing they reach for is giving each character a distinct personality. But while that is important, I think it's even more important as a writer to not forget the other options at your disposal, and I think this novel demonstrates that well. Sure, the characters all have fun personalities, and I'm literally about to talk about said personalities, but having a history and unique abilities is a huge part of what sold a frankly hard sell to begin with. It's absurdly difficult to thrust a giant cast of characters in front of the audience, expect them to care, and then have people, you know, care. But my boy Nisio done did that, and it wasn't just by giving them each a distinct personality. Although, like I said, they do have that. The personalities that stood out to me the most in this book are the ones that just scream NisiOisiN. You know, the ultra-specific, ultra-quirky personalities that stick with you forever. Maki Himena is a fortune teller who can see into the past, the future, and read people's minds. She generally gets along with most people, but she abhors Ichan. She knows his flaws just as well as he knows them due to her abilities, and she's willing to remind him at every possible turn just how truly vile of a person he is. Maki's role in the narrative is to lay Ichan's flaws out for the audience to witness, so that we can get a better idea of what kind of person he is. But I also just think her personality is interesting, partially because she has genuine criticisms of Ichan, even if they're sandwiched between pure shards of spite. But also because she just has such a radically distinct tone from most characters out there via her insults of Ichan being so ubiquitous in her dialogue. She feels kind of like a proto-Senjo Gahara in a way. Teruko Chiga, I told you I was gonna mention her, takes Ichan into a room and reveals that Iria fears the police because she has DLLR syndrome, a syndrome which makes it so that someone can't help but harm themselves and others, which caused her to kill her twin sister Odette. At first, this is presented to the reader as a genuine plot twist, but Teruko's evidence for Iria having this syndrome is scars on her wrist that she doesn't have. Although all the maids are liars, I'm getting ever closer to spoiling this story, I'm so sorry. Teruko seems the most avid about it. She's literally silent for like 2/3 of the story, then dedicates her first conversation with Ichan to telling him to die before spouting complete and utter nonsense at him for pages on end, seemingly just to do a little trolling. Incredibly obscure and quirky personalities seem to be one of Nisio's MOs, given that Monogatari is basically entirely dedicated to this style of character writing. But another trend in Nisio's writing that I've been champing at the bit to talk about is his casual inclusion of philosophy and worldview into his stories, and how it affects characterization. There are 2 big occurrences of this in Decapitation. The first is, funnily enough, in the prologue, where Ichan talks about the fundamental difference between people's ease of navigating the world coming down to genius. But soon after, Ichan walks out of Tomo's room for breakfast and sits down with akane Sonoyama at the table. And, well, if you remember from the beginning of this section, they have legitimately one of my favorite conversations in the entire book. Heh. So you're a feminist, or are you just being polite around me? Well, unfortunately, I'm not a feminist. Listening to talk about expanding women's rights and women's liberation makes me sick to my stomach. Holy hell, Akane, are you trying to get me banned from YouTube? Akane believes that even with equal opportunity, men and women will inevitably assume vastly different roles in society, with the strong implication being that these roles are what society has traditionally enforced in the past. Ichan, on the other hand, takes a more pro-feminist stance, and although at the end he says Akane sounds convincing, he never says he's been convinced, meaning that he really just wanted to weasel out of the argument, cause, you know, that's how Ichan rolls. I love this conversation. Not cause I agree with Akane, I don't, I'ma just throw that one out there. It's not plot relevant, nor does it particularly feel like Nisio using characters in his story as mouthpieces for his ideology, considering no part of it feels intended to be convincing, meaning it's solely there to characterize Akane and, to a lesser extent, Ichan. Obviously, your mileage will vary with this. It's objectively a long and winding conversation about a topic completely unrelated to anything in the preceding story, but I find it really cool that the novel is willing to spend time developing a natural-feeling ideological conversation between two characters even when it isn't strictly plot relevant. I don't know if I've said this in a video before, but I love it when stories give their characters ideologies and have discussions within them along ideological lines. It's not only one of the best ways to flesh out a character, but the discussions therein tend to hold me more than most other types of dialogue. Gender roles might be far-flung from this story's themes, but by giving Akane an ideology on top of her personality, it gives her character more dimension and weight. And the conversation certainly did hold me. I love Akane's personality while debating too. She's pragmatic and tells it bluntly how she sees it, and she does come off as harsh at times, but never aggressive or overly combative. She always just calmly explains her ideology, with utmost confidence in her opinions. Are you enjoying the video so far? Come on, you're supposed to answer the question. Say it so I can hear. Well, if you have been enjoying it so far, then boy, do I have an announcement that will positively pickle your plumbo. Have you ever wanted your username to be a different color on my incredibly toxic Discord server? Have you ever wanted me to say your name in each one of my uploads that usually come out half a month after they were supposed to? Do you want to make me rant about something niche for no reason other than your sick amusement, forcing a small YouTuber to dance monkey dance like a puppeteer pulling strings? Wait, you don't? Well, screw you too. Introducing Patreon. I would have made one earlier, but I figured I only really had a chance at making this my career once I hit 1,000 subs, so I held back my blatant grift until now. Okay, I'ma drop the sarcasm for a second. I wanna turn this whole YouTube shebang into my career, because I wanna write novels and draw stupid anime characters all day. So please, if you can afford it, and only if, consider donating to my Patreon. And with that, let's get back to the video.
So really, your shit's so fat you can't even see your own dick.
NisiOisiN is known for writing absurdly long and winding conversations. This is particularly evident in that one thing. In Monogatari, characters could go on for pages and pages and pages and pages, not progressing the story in a meaningful way. And I'm talking novels here, right? Though the same does hold true for the anime, just to a lesser extent. Monogatari crafted a very specific identity for itself in regards to its dialogue, and that identity was having characters exchange witty retorts, act out dialogue-driven comedic skits, talk about niche subjects, and pun it up till the heat death of the universe, with the plot simmering in the background somewhere in a galaxy far, far away. The conversations in Gatari go on so long with so little progress being made in the narrative that in Nisei Monogatari Volume 1, Nisio literally has Araragi say, "The book's gonna have a plot soon, just bear with me guys." I laugh every single time I think about this line, and to this day I have no clue if I'm laughing with Nisio or at him. Zaregoto differs a bit in this regard. Part of the point of Monogatari is to feature long conversations with little purpose, but in Zaregoto, it isn't nearly so ubiquitous. Don't get me wrong, there's still a ton of dialogue, but it's not as self-indulgent as that from Gatari, and carries more of a feeling of consistent forward motion. The first 100 or so pages of the book are dedicated to setting up our colorful cast of characters, and I can see some people getting bored here from the still quite lengthy conversations and heaps of dry exposition, but there wasn't a single conversation that I think the book would be better without. The dialogue is consistently intent on fleshing out the potential suspects and victims as well as it can in exquisite detail that doesn't feel like it's belaboring or avoiding the point, which lends this section of the book a sense of constant progress. Due to the general lack of the verbal clashes seen so frequently in Monogatari, this novel is definitely less comedic than that series, so take that how you will. But that didn't bother me. Once the murder mystery kicks in, the detailed dialogue mostly shifts from character building to plot building. Once again, I could see some people still being bored here. The mystery part of the book has a lot of long conversations sporting oodles and oodles of logic. After all, the mystery needs to be solved by our two leads, and solving a locked room puzzle requires a lot of throwing around and rejecting different possibilities, based on logical analysis of the situation. And maybe that's tedious to some people, but I'm one of those insane people who liked the pages-long explanations of fight scenes in Katanagatari. If you've listened to the Castaway Anime podcast, you may have heard one of my thrice-per-episode reminders that I don't really gravitate towards action scenes. On the flip side, I love tactics. In my ideal world, a fight scene would be 5 minutes of the characters standing around and talking, 2 minutes of them actually fighting, and then the episode prior where the main character loquaciously explains what their strategy will be going into the fight. So a story with only a single action scene where most of the plot progresses from characters logically analyzing a puzzle is basically a match made in heaven for me. The main thing that makes Decapitation so easy to binge read is that every conversation feels substantive or like it progresses your understanding of the plot and characters, and it never goes on too long without meaningful progress. In Monogatari, you can go 20 pages without anything really happening aside from pun. Zaregoto is not like that, even if it's still verbose enough to live up to Nisio's credentials. This section isn't meant to put down Monogatari necessarily, but rather to demonstrate the many shades of Nisio's dialogue, and how this alters the appeal of each story. As a fan of both, and an equally big fan of their shared author, comparisons like this are intriguing to me, and I hope they are to you too.
Shockwaves to finish the job, because if that guy had shockwaves after he railed me like that from behind...
If you want to go into the novel mostly spoiler-free, now's your chance. Go on your merry way and read a novel that I would personally give a 9 out of 10 to. I think this novel is way better to read unspoiled, as there's a certain, insane plot twist that recontextualizes much of the novel and had me pogging IRL. I also just think the ending is very emotionally resonant at certain points, and that the emotions of the story hit harder when you don't know what's about to happen. That's your warning. Spoilers begin in 3, 2, 1. Kanami is the first victim, Akane is the second victim, Akane did it, Akane's actually dead and Kanami did it, Shinya helped Kanami do it, Ichan accepts death but gets spared in the nick of time. Anyway, let's talk about that. Therapist style, just you and me, processing the ramifications of what happens in the finale of this story. I've been avoiding talking about this for the sake of spoilers, but Zaregoto's locked room murder mystery contains, well, 2 supposedly locked rooms with no means of entrance or escape, and 2/1 victims, Kanami Ibuki and Akane Sonoyama. After the first murder, Akane is the prime suspect. She's the only person without an alibi, discounting the possibility of an accomplice, and she has a motive, her hatred of Kanami. However, after Akane becomes the second victim, she's ruled out, and the list of suspects becomes a whole lot more complicated. Of course, this whole murder mystery doesn't work in the first place if the police are able to solve it for the main characters. However, due to a whole slew of reasons, be it the reputation of geniuses, or July Katakawa's imminent arrival, or Iria uttering an entire rosary of killing in the name of every night, the police are not made aware of the murders. But eventually, Ichan and Tomo come to a consensus on who did it. By Ichan's own admission, his solution requires ignoring some unsolved questions. His focus is on an efficient solution rather than an airtight one, but nonetheless, it's good enough to bring an end to these murder mystery shenanigans. What follows is probably my favorite scene in the novel. Decapitation by no means concludes the entirety of Ichan's character arc, nor does it go into much depth in regards to his traumatic history. That is almost certainly explored further in future volumes, but it does provide a bit of character development for him. Ichan and Tomo concoct a scheme to bait the killer into a position where they can catch her red-handed. I won't bore you with the details, all that matters is that Ichan's primary concern in this plan is to make sure that Tomo stays safe. He has Tomo jump Shinya and presumably get everyone to keep an eye on him, and make sure he goes nowhere. Then he runs into Yayoi's room, where he confronts the killer. Something I love about this scene, and that can only be accomplished this well in prose, is that the killer still isn't revealed at this stage. She's always referred to as my attacker, or she in Ichan's narration, which is just such a cool way to write it. The entire confrontation is so golden, as the book builds and builds anticipation, letting the reader's mind speculate wildly even at this late stage of the game. I actually checked this scene's anime counterpart for curiosity's sake, and yup, you can totally tell it's Akane, even if the anime does its best to obscure her in order to replicate the same atmosphere the novel had. Still, it isn't quite as gripping in my opinion. After a nail-biting action scene wherein Teruko comes to I-chan's rescue before promptly getting
shot in the chest with a rifle.
I-chan gets the gun pointed squarely at him next, and upon being confronted with imminent death, I-chan accepts it. Welcomes it even. My paralyzed train of thought. My breaking values, my melting ethics, my collapsing morals. None of it mattered now. I would forgive it all. So, pull that trigger and end it, please. I-chan's one and only plan was to not get Tomo involved. If he managed to outdo the killer in combat, that'd be cool. But if he can't, that'd be cool too. He did not come to this room to die, but he did come accepting of the possibility of death. Because I-chan has no attachment to the world. He is not invested. He can just come and go as he pleases. At least, that's what he tells himself. But Tomo overcomes her acute phobia of elevation to climb a flight of stairs upon hearing the first gunshot, and comes to the rescue. Haha, not really. Akane has a gun. But at that moment, I-chan realizes he is attached to the world. He is invested. Despite what he tells himself, despite his crippling apathy, I-chan cannot afford to die. He has one person he truly cares about and has fun next to. I'm in love with this girl, so please, don't do anything, I begged the woman. Like she was truly having a ball, sing-song laughter. I've still got my complaints, but well, she opened her mouth. This time, just getting to hear a guy like you utter such an innocent line will do, I guess. Now, in my view, there are two reasons why I-chan refuses to get with Tomo for most of the story. One is that he got with her in the past for the purpose of destruction, which makes him unwilling to get with her again. That's not really explored in this novel, and isn't relevant to this scene. Instead, although this isn't explicitly stated in the novel, the implication I got was that the far bigger reason why I-chan refuses to get with Tomo is that he finds convenience in being unattached to the world. I-chan deems his apathy torture, but there is nonetheless a benefit to being apathetic. If the torture becomes unbearable, well, if you're unattached to life, you don't need to bear it. You can end it all on a whim, like I-chan nearly did. Not to mention that being emotionally invested in something, by definition, requires expending emotional resources. Sometimes, it's a lot easier to navigate the world unfeeling towards it all. And most of the time, I-chan really is unattached and devoid of emotion. And that's why it's easy for him to tell himself that he can leave at any time. But then there's Tomo. Tomo is the one person who brings light to his life. He wants to be chosen by her, he wants to be her one and only, yet simultaneously, he can't bring himself to date her. He doesn't want to become invested in life. He doesn't want to get too anchored. Because if he does that, he can't leave on his own terms anymore. He no longer has the excuse that nobody will care. He will lose the convenience of being uninvested. If he dates Tomo, he's planted firmly in place. And yet, at that moment, facing both of their deaths, he realizes how truly invested in Tomo he is. How his entire plan revolved around keeping her safe. How the idea that Tomo might die right now is more painful to him than even his own death. So, he bites the bullet. He becomes invested in life. I think this is an incredibly satisfying character resolution for this novel, and is even pretty subtly written, with the story leaving the viewer just enough room for interpretation that it feels like you have to connect the dots in order to figure out why I-chan do the things he do. Very cool stuff. And then, we get what is probably the most badass line in the entire story. Saying so cynically, Akane Sonoyama tossed the gun aside. After an entire chapter of building to this reveal of the killer as I-chan's having a huge character moment, this line hits deep. This scene is just non-stop kino. It really is great. So, what is the evidence, aside from the literal smoking gun, that Akane is the killer? Well, since I didn't delve into the mystery itself in this video, I kinda don't have the proper groundwork built to explain this whole shebang, but I'll give you the SparkNotes version. So, obviously, Akane can't be the second victim if she's actually the killer. So, what she and Shinya did was make the decapitated corpse of Kanami pose as Akane's, a body swap. Shinya buried Kanami's body in front of Ichan and Tomo, but he did so in a way that was very suspect. He put Kanami's body in a sleeping bag as a makeshift coffin. But why would someone bring a sleeping bag with them to a mansion with king-sized beds? It's really weird the more you think about it, but its purpose in the murder is clear. Pretend the sleeping bag is a makeshift coffin, while in actuality, its purpose is to make sure that no soil gets on the corpse. Then, the corpse can be reused in order to give the killer, Akane, the ultimate alibi. The second locked room technically had a means of escape through a window, but the window was so high up that it was deemed a locked room. However, the window was accessible from the outside because the mansion is partially built into a hill. While many means of escape using an accomplice and this window were ruled out, the one actually used was Kanami's dead body. Her body was used as a step stool thanks to some post-death process I forgot the name of where your body stiffens. So, Shinya took Kanami's body out of the sleeping bag, gave it to Akane in said locked room where she was being kept prisoner due to being the prime suspect, and she used it as both a step stool and for her body swap. Akane's goal was to eventually kill everyone on the island, but she got caught before a second life could be taken. So, that's that. Akane and Shinya are banned from ever going on Wet Crow's Feather Island again, although they don't get arrested due to reasons, and everyone lives happily ever... Wait, this is the Nonsense series. What? That actually made quite a bit of sense. Like, that was a clever and fun, but pretty normal murder mystery, all things considered. Well, to be fair, I'm not overly familiar with Hankaku novels, but this seemed like a pretty normal one to me. Going into the Nonsense series, I had the vague impression that it was known for its incredibly convoluted mysteries, but upon finishing the mystery, I came away with the impression that it was fairly normal? And then Jun Aikawa appeared, or as I prefer to call her, Rage Girl. It is way funnier to call her Rage Girl, trust me. Rage Girl has been set up throughout the novel as a genius detective who Iria is head over heels for. Hikari describes her as someone who is perpetually angry at the world, and solves cases through sheer rage, which instantly made me not just want to see her, but need to see her on page. From the beginning, she was set to visit the island on the same day Ichan and Tomo were set to leave it. Then, when the murder mystery began, Iria trusted that when Rage Girl appeared, she'd be able to crack the mystery no problem. But unfortunately, Ichan and Tomo solved the mystery before her hero could come in and solve it herself. But one does not just set up a genius detective without having them do genius detective things. Remember when I said Ichan and Tomo's solution didn't tie up all the loose ends? That was important. They got the gist of it right, and indeed, the person acting as Akane Sonoyama was the killer. They got the right girl, physically speaking, but they did not crack her identity. Rage Girl beats Ichan senseless after he exits the store one day, which is one of the character introductions of all time. Then she takes him to her car, to which Ichan thinks he's about to get kidnapped. But she proceeds to explain that she's the Jun Aikawa that Iria was talking about, and that while he did a good job of cracking the case, he missed a few crucial details. So in one scene, Kanami is staring down Ichan in a room, memorizing him so that she can later paint him. In that scene, Ichan is not wearing a watch, but in the final painting, you notice his hand. It has a watch. This is very interesting. Now, it is technically possible that Kanami herself would have painted him with a watch, and the book sort of indirectly acknowledges that possibility. At the beginning of the book, Ichan sees Kanami and Shinya together, with Kanami sort of spacing out watching cherry blossom petals fall. So it is possible that Kanami saw Ichan with his watch in this scene. Furthermore, he was on the island for 2 days prior to the book's events, where Kanami could have seen him with his watch. But nonetheless, it is weird how Kanami intentionally stared at Ichan for like 3 hours straight, memorizing every detail of him without his watch on, and then proceeded to draw the watch that wasn't there. So, what if the Kanami facing Ichan at that time didn't draw Ichan? In fact, based on evidence that would take too long to get into, the Kanami facing Ichan at that time probably didn't know the first thing about painting, and the whole memorization biz was just a front to cover up the fact that she didn't know how to paint. Sure, it's possible that Kanami would draw him that way, but it's still a question mark, right? Why would Shinya kill Kanami? The two of them have been together for years, with Shinya as her caretaker. Sure, you can imagine a motive, but it's still a question mark, right? And the final piece of evidence. Kanami and Akane, despite seemingly having a furious hatred of each other throughout the novel, according to intel Tomo was able to gather via her hacker connections, were spotted eating lunch together at a cafe in Chicago, and were apparently part of a super secret club. Why would these two people who utterly hate each other seemingly be on good terms in the past? Sure, it's possible that they became mortal enemies after this point, but it's still a question mark, right? Thus, we reach our nonsensical conclusion. Kanami and Akane, as friends, were playing a game with everyone where they switched places while visiting the Wet Crow's Feather Island. They wanted to see whether any of the other geniuses would be able to put all the clues together and discover that they were both LARPing as each other. Their feigned hatred of each other was probably part of their game. However, Kanami held a deep-rooted jealousy of Akane's very life. So, while dressed up as Akane, she killed the real Akane, thus becoming the new Akane. To give herself an airtight alibi, she made up an entire murder mystery that was intended to be solved. With the knowledge that the police would never come to collect DNA evidence, she wanted whatever detective visited the island to come to the conclusion that Akane was the killer. Then, she'd be let off free while banned from the island, with her old identity as Kanami presumed dead and Shinya now by Akane's side. The perfect alibi. Kanami's dead and her killer has already been found, so there's no reason to look into the case any further. Now, admittedly, this ending was a tough pill to swallow at first. Akane was, after all, my favorite of the side characters, so to hear that the Akane I fell in love with was actually Kanami pretending to be Akane, yeah, that definitely rubbed me the wrong way at first. But as out there as this ending is, I think it's genuinely a more satisfying resolution to the story than the former. It ties up all the loose ends, and it also circles back to the story's main themes by A, having Ichan get outplayed by two geniuses, and B, injecting a whole bunch of nonsense into the Nonsense series. It's also just a fun twist in my opinion. Does this ending make sense? In a weird way, yes, albeit it's still very out there. But it does make enough sense to buy into this incredibly whacked out mystery story. From what I can gather, the joke of the Zaregoto series, if you will, is that Ichan, typically unwillingly, will have to solve some mystery, and he'll come to a conclusion about it. Then, the genius detective Rage Girl will come in at the last minute and tell Ichan why everything he did was actually pointless, and that he came to the wrong conclusion. The truth, then, is so out there that guessing it is nigh impossible unless you're smoking crack cocaine. At least, that's my impression of this series based on what others have said about it, as well as this novel. What utter nonsense that formula is. But it seems like a fun time to me. At least, I know I'll be reading the rest of this series ASAP, albeit my need to make videos on it will certainly keep my progress slow and steady. When I first watched Bakemonogatari back in, God, it's been 2.5 years already, I honestly didn't even like it that much. Well, okay, I gave it an 8. But I wasn't obsessed with it. Until I was. Monogatari was the anime that refused to leave my brain. And yeah, part of that is on Shaft and Oishi, but Nisio's addicting dialogue took up far more space in my brain than any show has before or frankly since. The more I delved into Nisio's writing, the more weirdly attached to this guy's art I felt. And yeah, a big part of that is because his novels are just plain good, featuring intense creativity and brilliant sense of characterization. But it's not even like he always writes my favorite shows/novels. I have major criticisms for most things he's written. Katanagatari has one of the worst attempts at a subversive ending I've ever suffered through. But art, at its core, communicates. Not only a story and a message, but an author's personality and worldview. And the personality of NisiOisiN's art resonates with me deeper than any other artist I've witnessed. This is for many reasons, but I want to fixate on just one right now. What I'd consider to be the moment where NisiOisiN's writing resonated with me the hardest is a scene in the first volume of the Sekai series. Spoiler alert, Byoinzaka attempts that thing I can't say on YouTube by trying to jump off the school roof. The scene's kinda goofy, actually. Byoinzaka starts muttering under her breath while ignoring everything Samatoki's telling her for like a few pages, just walking through the school in bloomers, before yeeting herself off the edge. It's a little funny in retrospect. Just a tad. But it's the reason why Byoinzaka tries to jump that I relate to so much. Wait, that came out wrong. I promise I want to live! I would prefer dying than having something I don't know. You shouldn't be able to bear it either. The world is progressing without any issue, even though things are unclear. It's like being told to approve the contradictions and ignore the fallacies. I hate not understanding, but what I hate even more is running away from things I don't get, Samatoki-kun. Life has been a nest of worries from the very beginning, you know? Not understanding how and where things were, not understanding what was happening. Everyone led their lives sloppily, letting that pass, but it's impossible for me. I can't comprehend, no matter what, the feeling of being excited when encountering something unknown, and since I can't comprehend it, I'm scared again. I get the sense that most people live their lives with the impression that they at least understand the world on a basic level. And I know, this is coming from a stupid teenager. Spamming X to doubt right now is the appropriate reaction. But the fact that I'm even typing this sentence right now may very well be indicative of the point. Because I can't live like that, and Byoinzaka is in fact my overthinking demon. Sure, everyone who isn't a narcissist is vaguely aware that they can't possibly understand the world with much completeness, but I feel like I get hung up on it more than the average person. I can assure you, every single point I've presented in a video in the past few months has been thought over ruthlessly and anxiously under the assumption that my brain is mush and my logic is crayon scribbles. I've spent time legitimately haunted by the fact that you can't disprove solipsism. When CGP Grey talked about the what is true dimension in that one video, my reaction was, damn bro, that really do be me though. And since I'm kind of a perfectionist, my fear of being wrong about something, in tandem with how easy it actually is to be wrong about something, turns the world into some sort of nightmarish labyrinth in my eyes. I guess I'm predisposed to this sort of thing in the first place, since I consider myself to be the over-analytical type. Now you may be wondering, hey, isn't this video supposed to be about Zaregoto? And the answer to that question is, yeah. But I say all this to beg the question. What kind of person writes Byoinzaka, the ultimate overthinker? What kind of person writes Ichan, the hyper-self-aware protagonist who admits that he doesn't really want to know the truth and sees the truth as completely out of his grasp? So my parents are libertarians. I have nothing against that or anything, but last night while we were eating dinner, they were talking about why they aligned themselves with that ideology. And that got me wondering, what are my political beliefs? But then I started thinking, well, there's super smart people on all sides, aren't there? And some of those super smart people have spent their entire lives studying politics, haven't they? And furthermore, these super smart people violently, vehemently disagree with each other, and both sides cite evidence to support their claims, and disagree about what evidence is or isn't valid. How could I possibly think that my take on politics holds any weight compared to theirs? Thinking about that made me discouraged, so I decided that I will not be rooting for any ideology, and will instead join the Snake Gang for the sole purpose of unity within my family. That passage is from my novel, Just face it, this entire video was secretly an ad for my book. You've been lied to this whole time. But yeah, when I wrote a protagonist, I decided to make her just like me for real. And I think the personality conveyed through Nisio's work is kinda like me for real. And the only reason I can think of as to why these novels would turn out that way is that they reflect some aspect of NisiOisiN as a person. And maybe it's cringe, bringe, and even fringe to speculate about the worldview of some dude in his 40s based on novels he wrote 2 decades and change ago. Especially because he nigh certainly did a lot of that latter thing within that span of time. And furthermore, maybe I'm literally making this connection up out of thin air. But considering just how much Nisio's writing connects with this facet of myself, the idea that I'm making this all up is a tough pill to swallow. Whether it be the obsessive amounts of logic typically presented in his stories, or the incredibly self-aware characters, or characters who have very particular logical processes, or the incessant monologuing, or the general inclusion of philosophies and worldview in his stories, or how when Nisio was the narrator in Katanagatari, a third-person novel, he couldn't help himself from constantly explaining why the characters were doing what they were doing, as if he himself desperately needed to know, or how even the first-person narrators sometimes can't help themselves from endlessly analyzing why the characters are acting in the ways they do. Or how in every story he seems to try his absolute hardest to get to the very core of who his characters are in a way very few other stories can accomplish or even try to do. Or how his afterwords are somewhat intellectual yet simultaneously seem kinda self-conscious. Nisio's stories are presented in a way that I inherently find familiar and resonant. They speak to this over-analytical and chronically overthinking side of myself that vomits out like 15 trains of logic at a time and leaves the rest of me scrambling to make sense of it all. Sure, Nisio is no perfectionist in the same way I am. I envy his ability to not get hung up on his mistakes. Yes, I read every interview with Nisio in it I can find. Is that even a question at this point? But I can't help but feel a sense of kinship or like-mindedness in this aspect of his storytelling. I by no means intend to come off as if I know the first thing about Nisio as a person. I don't. Not one bit aside from my being the interview goblin. And maybe this section is weird, and maybe. But it's something I've had floating around in my head for a while, and I need to put this into words somehow. I doubt this section is entirely correct, frankly. I don't know what Nisio is like, and I doubt I know my own feelings that well, and really this is all above me. Yet simultaneously, I'm probably overthinking it, and I actually nailed it square in the head. I feel that sort of anxious contradiction, where I can analyze my feelings and these stories till the sun sets, but make little progress in the way of rectifying all the perhapses. Someday, if this becomes the video series I hope it will be, if I end up covering every single volume of Zaregoto, perhaps even the Ningen and Saikyo series, I want to look back on the ending of this video. I'm sure I'll disagree with at least something I said here. Perhaps my entire line of thinking to begin with is flawed. After all, I am a self-admitted overthinker and overanalyzer. Or maybe, perhaps, kind of, sort of, to a certain extent and possibly. But whatever revelation I have down the line, I hope I can cherish it.